Welcome back to the Nietzsche, Krishna, Buddha, Christ series. This is the fourth video, and we are continuing the analysis of Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, Out of the Spirit of Music. And I'm saying that there is a hidden riddle in the birth of tragedy, and that the solution to the riddle is that Nietzsche was secretly applying the theological equations that the Greeks who followed Alexander the Great into India used when they equated the gods of India with the gods of Greece. Specifically, they equated Krishna with Heracles, who the Romans called Hercules, and they equated Shiva with Dionysus. That's the solution to the riddle I'm saying that Nietzsche hid in the birth of tragedy, and that would indicate that Nietzsche's God all along has been Krishna. Even in his later books, when he claims to be the prophet of the Antichrist and he says God is dead, I'm claiming that was a mask that he wore in an attempt to imitate Krishna's Buddha avatar. So Krishna, according to many schools of Vaishnavism, who worship Vishnu, the branch of Hinduism that worships Vishnu as the supreme god, Krishna is the original Vishnu, and one of his avatars, one of the forms of Vishnu who comes to the earth, is Buddha, pretending to be an atheist, to give the atheistically inclining people of that era at least the fundamental principles to behave morally, and to prepare civilization gradually to return back to an understanding of the personal God and an individual soul. That is Nietzsche's plan. He said, I could be the Buddha of Europe, and I believe that's what he meant, Krishna's Buddha avatar. So, but in his first book, he's openly theistic. So Nietzsche was born the son of a Lutheran pastor, the grandson of two other Lutheran pastors. He had a lot of other Lutheran pastors in his lineage. He was training to become a Lutheran pastor. He entered college intending to study theology to become a pastor. Then after his first semester, during his Easter break, he refused to take communion at Mass, and he told his mother he didn't believe in God and Christ anymore. That was 1865. I'm saying by the time he published The Birth of Tragedy in 1872, he believed in God again, and he believed in the very popular theory of the day, which was promoted in various forms, or at least debated by Sanskrit philologists and the popular writer Louis Jacoliot, that the theory was that the stories of Jesus Christ were based on the older stories of Krishna. So I am saying, in his mind, Nietzsche believed by becoming a devotee of Krishna, he was embracing the original root of Christianity and following the religion that he believed Jesus Christ himself secretly believed in, even though he wore the mask of an antichrist. Okay, so I went over all that in the first video, and I've been reviewing it in each of the subsequent videos. So continuing here in the analysis of The Birth of Tragedy, I'm going to pick up close to where we left off, and it was the three places in The Birth of Tragedy where Nietzsche mentions Heracles. So it's sections 10 and sections 10 and 19. He mentions Heracles twice in section 10 and once in section 19. So let me go back. The Birth of Tragedy, section 10. Here's what Nietzsche asks. He says, what power was it that freed Prometheus from his vultures and transformed the myth into a vehicle of Dionysian wisdom? It is the Heracleian power of music. Having reached its highest manifestation in tragedy, it can invest myths with a new and most profound significance. What did you want, sacrilegious Euripides, when you sought to compel this dying myth to serve you once more? It died under your violent hands, and then you needed a copied, masked myth that, like the ape of Heracles, merely knew how to deck itself out in the ancient pomp. So he mentions the Heraclean power of music. The myth of Prometheus, the belief in the gods, was dying, says Nietzsche, in the 5th century B.C.E. in Greece. But when the art form of tragic drama developed, it gave a new life to the myths, because the power of music can activate the underlying archetype represented by the masked figures of the gods. And he directly mentions Plato's theory of absolute ideas, that music is a direct copy of the underlying will of the universe, unlike the plastic arts of sculpture and painting, which imitate the illusory forms rising from the underlying will. Music is a medium through which to come in contact with the will itself. And the will, the underlying will of the universe, the ground of being, is where the Platonic ideas, the absolute forms, the perfect exemplars exist. And all of the temporary mirage-like forms of matter radiate from these absolute ideas. Music puts us in contact with the absolute ideas, and that's why music played as the background to the tragic plays brought out the ultimate meaning of the plays, specifically the masked image of the god, and that the spectators in this religiously and politically sanctioned sphere could actually observe an image of the god, and they could see themselves as eternal servants of the gods, specifically the bearded satyr. The chorus of singing satyrs started as this chorus of men dressed as half goat, half man, playmates and servants of the god Dionysus, who was son of Zeus and the mortal woman Semele, according to some versions, and the Orphic version, I believe it was Demeter. I've got to read this again. But the point is, the Heracleian power of music gave this myth the power to become a vehicle of Dionysian wisdom. So Dionysus represents the underlying will. Apollo, Dionysus's brother, represents the illusion of individual forms, which he relates specifically with Immanuel Kant's concept of the a priori, categories of thought, space-time, and causality. So I went over those details in the previous videos. And then Euripides. So according to Nietzsche, Euripides, who was Socrates' friend, ruined the tragic plays from within. He was a tragic playwright by emphasizing the rational discussions among the characters as opposed to trying to tap into the archetypal idea that triggers the instinctual reactions of the observing participants of the play. So he said it died under your violent hands, and then you needed a copied masked myth like the ape of Heracles, merely knew how to deck itself out in the ancient pomp. So if a masked myth, an imitation tragic play, is the ape of Heracles, the implication is genuine tragic plays are Heracles himself. So Dionysus is the famous god focused on in the birth of tragedy, but in section 10, the Heracleian power of music gives the myth of Prometheus the power to become a vehicle of Dionysian wisdom, and then real tragic plays are compared to Heracles by contrasting them with the fake tragic plays of Euripides, except the Bacchae, which Nietzsche praises, which are the ape of Heracles. Okay, so Heracles. The ancient Greeks, who followed Alexander into India, called Krishna Heracles, and they called Shiva Dionysus. Megasthenes, the historian who entered India and was ambassador, or he followed with Chandragupta. At any rate, the point is this: Megasthenes was a historian. He wrote a book called the Indica, which is now gone, but fragments have survived in other classical writers. And he was the one who first started this theological equation of Krishna and Heracles. So Nietzsche read Christian Lassen, a Sanskrit philologist, German-speaking Sanskrit philologist. In 1867 and 1868, he borrowed volume 1 of his book, Indische Altertumskunde, Indian Classical Studies, where Lassen spells this whole theory out. And I'm saying that Nietzsche picked up on that, if from nowhere else, at least from Lassen, and that he's applying that. When he says Heracles, he means Krishna. And when he says Dionysus, he means Shiva. All right, so now notice in section 19 how Nietzsche links the Dionysian spirit with Heracles. So section 19, the birth of tragedy. What hopes must revive in us when the most certain auspices guarantee the reverse process, the gradual awakening of the Dionysian spirit in our modern world? It is impossible that the divine strength of Heracles should languish forever in ample bondage to Omphale. So, for the Dionysian spirit to awaken in our modern world, it depends on Heracles no longer languishing in ample bondage to Omphale. So that's where we left off in episode 3. Ample bondage to Omphale. So Omphale was the widowed queen of Lydia, and Heracles had murdered an innocent man, and then the Oracle of Delphi said that to purge him of his sin, he needed to be sold into slavery for a year. Queen Omphale bought him. I forget the details of how that transaction happened, but at any rate, she insisted that he wear women's clothes and assist her at the loom spinning cloth while she wore his clothes and carried his club. So ample bondage to Omphale. The luxurious slavery to Omphale is another translation of it. So when Heracles is released from this ample bondage, then the Dionysian spirit will wake up in modern Europe. Well, that implies that the Dionysian spirit is emanating from Heracles. So as I've discussed before, according to the Krishna worshipping branch of Hinduism, the Vaishnava, Vishnu worshipping branch, and some schools of Vaishnava say Krishna is the original form of Vishnu. Furthermore, Shiva is Krishna's shadow side, presiding over Krishna's dream, which is the material megaverse of universes. So Krishna's Mahavishnu incarnation descends from the spiritual world, Vaikuntha, goes to sleep on the causal ocean, and exhales all of the bubble universes out from the pores of his skin and then back in over, one breath of Mahavishnu's trillions and trillions of years. I forget the exact number. But for the point of studying the birth of tragedy and discovering the riddle in it, the main point is that this is God's dream. This is Vishnu's dream. This is Krishna's dream. We live in Krishna's dream. That's important because Dionysus and Apollo are the two main gods discussed in the birth of tragedy. And in section 1, Nietzsche compares Apollo to the veil of Maya. In Hindu thought, Maya is the goddess of illusion. She creates the temporary material forms that we perceive rising from the underlying ground of being Brahman. So Nietzsche, following Arthur Schopenhauer, he calls Brahman the will. In later books, he would call it the will to power. And Maya, the goddess of the illusion of individual forms, is also responsible for the concept of individual eternal personalities, which the complementary side of Brahman, it's called Atman, the individual personal particle of consciousness. Now, Schopenhauer was following Shankara's 8th century common era interpretation of the Vedanta philosophy of India, which says that the idea of an individual soul is an illusion and it should be merged back into Brahman like a salt doll, a doll made of salt merging back into the ocean. And I'm saying Nietzsche rejected that by the time he wrote The Birth of Tragedy, starting in 1869. So he discovered Schopenhauer in 1865 and became an immediate disciple. 6 months after he renounced Christianity, he discovered Arthur Schopenhauer, who has an atheistic view of the world, though not a materialistic view. He does perceive that the material world is an illusion created by these concepts, these categories of thought, space, time, and causality, which are not empirically observable. You can't see, smell, touch, taste, or hear space or time or causal chains in a chain of causes and effects. That's an illusion, and Schopenhauer says, yeah, and the Indian philosophers call that Maya. Immanuel Kant called them the a priori categories of thought. Hindus call it the veil of Maya. Schopenhauer gave Nietzsche that idea of equating Kant and the veil of Maya, and he says Apollo represents the veil of Maya. And I'm saying that's part of the riddle in The Birth of Tragedy, because also in section 1 and in section 4 of The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche talks about a reproductive sexual relationship between Dionysus and Apollo. The Dionysian and Apollonian forces of nature, the primordial impulses of the artistic instincts, have this sexual antipathy that occasionally results in the glorious consummation of the child of some cultural production, culminating with tragic plays. So why would Nietzsche use this impossible metaphor of homosexual incest to create tragic plays? And I'm saying the reason that he did that was a clue that when he says Dionysus, he means Shiva, and he openly equates Apollo with the veil of Maya. So Maya is Shiva's wife, and I'm saying the sexual relationship that he indicates between Dionysus and Apollo, and elsewhere he calls he calls them fraternal gods, is one clue pointing to Shiva and Maya behind Dionysus and Apollo. And if he's relating Dionysus with Shiva, then it makes sense to say he's furthermore relating Heracles with Krishna. And when we see section 10 and 19, it's clear that Dionysus is a subsidiary emanation from Heracles, who is the more primary god. All right, so ample bondage to Omphale. That leads us to this next section of my paper, section 5. So this is a key to Nietzsche's Riddles and the Birth of Tragedy. And there's a link to academia.edu where the paper can be read. So here is a letter Nietzsche wrote in the summer of 1872, 6 or so months after he published it, on January 3rd, 1872. And so the reaction was uncomprehending derision, and in the case of Ulrich Wilhelmowitz Moellendorff, it was outright an attack, but even his mentor, Friedrich Riddle, I don't know if I'm pronouncing these names correctly, but Friedrich Riddle wrote Nietzsche a recommendation letter that got him hired as a professor of philology before he even submitted a dissertation. He said he'll be able to do anything he wants to do. He's such a talented person, he'll be able to accomplish anything. His interest is in philosophy, but whatever you need him to do, he'll be able to do it. That got Nietzsche hired. This book was expected to be some kind of a substitute for a dissertation, and when it came out, there were no citations linking it to other philologists. It was not the standard form of a philological dissertation that people were expecting. Instead, it was this inspired work of artistic grandiloquence. And Wilhelmowitz Moellendorff was saying he should resign. He's going to corrupt the minds of the youth, similar to what they accused Socrates of in Athens and had him killed for by drinking hemlock. So I'm just going to read here for the paper. This is page 38. So here's what Nietzsche says in that letter. The philologists of the present age have proven themselves unworthy of being permitted to include me and my books in their number. It hardly needs to be asserted that in this instance as well, it is entirely up to them whether or not they want to learn something, but I am not in the least inclined to compromise with them. What today calls itself philology, and which I have intentionally designated in this neutral manner, he puts the word philology in quotation marks. So what today calls itself philology ignore my book once again, for it is masculine by nature and it is not suited for castrati. They are better suited for sitting at the loom of textual reconstruction. So when the other philologists condemned the book, Richard Wagner loved it because Nietzsche dedicated it to Wagner in the foreword to Richard Wagner. And he also talks about the cover picture of the book, which is Prometheus Unbound, which is going to be important for what we're going to be talking about in this video. So Wagner loved it, the artistic community loved it, but the professional philologists did not love it. Some of them hated it, and so that was Nietzsche's response to them. He goes, let them ignore my book, for it is masculine by nature, and it is not suited for castrati. They are better suited for sitting at the loom of textual reconstruction. I'm saying that when he said it's masculine by nature, not suited for castrati, and they're better suited for sitting at the loom of textual reconstruction, that was a clue pointing us back to section 19, where Nietzsche says, what hopes must revive in us when the most certain auspices guarantee the reverse process, the gradual awakening of the Dionysian spirit in our modern world. It is impossible that the divine strength of Heracles should languish forever in ample bondage to Omphale. So Heracles had to sit at the loom. He had to sit at the loom of Omphale and dressed as a woman. So when Nietzsche says they're better, they're castrati, so they're emasculated. They've been castrated. And now they're sitting at the loom of textual reconstruction. I'm saying he was thinking of Heracles dressed as a woman sitting at Omphale's loom. And Nietzsche's comparing the philologists who hated his book to Heracles in this ample bondage to Omphale. so that they need to come out. Whereas he himself, he says, my book is masculine by nature. Now, the word masculine is a reference, I'm saying, to section 9 of The Birth of Tragedy, where Nietzsche discusses the myth of Prometheus, remembering that he identifies himself with Prometheus Unbound in the foreword to Richard Wagner, and by using the picture of Prometheus Unbound in on the cover of the book. And then we saw in section 10, it was the Heracleian power of music that freed Prometheus from his vultures. So Nietzsche identifies himself with Prometheus, and he talks about Heracles freeing Prometheus. So Heracles is Nietzsche's own savior, and I'm saying he was thinking Krishna, because he's applying the Alexandrian-era equations of Greek and Indian gods. So, masculine by nature. So here I'm going to read a little bit here. This is page 38. So I say, Wagner loved it, Wilamowitz, Moellendorff, and Riddle did not. Nevertheless, in the letter above, Nietzsche, previously hailed as an up-and-coming phenom among philologists, hints that there is valuable information for philologists to learn in his first book if they put forth the masculine effort that knowledge demands. In light of section 9 of The Birth of Tragedy, where Nietzsche contrasts the Aryan creation myth of the Greeks, the myth of Prometheus, and the Semitic creation myth of the Jews, the story of Adam and Eve, as masculine and feminine, quote, like brother and sister, unquote, I argue that his claim that his colleagues cannot understand his book because it is masculine by nature is a hint that the underlying philological meaning is related to the cultural link between the Aryan civilization of India and ancient Greece. So, his book is masculine. In section 9, he talks about the myth of Prometheus. Prometheus was one of the older order of gods, the Titans, who were overthrown by the Olympians, headed by Zeus. So Prometheus created the human species. And then he stole fire from Mount Olympus, from the gods on Mount Olympus, and he gave it to the humans, despite Zeus telling him not to do that. And for his punishment, Zeus chained him to a rock and had vultures or an eagle, depending on the version of the myth, eat his liver every day. But because he's a god, he cannot die, so his liver would regenerate, and he would have to go through this again and again and again. It was Heracles who brokered a deal with his father Zeus to have Prometheus freed from his chains and his vultures, which Nietzsche alludes to in section 10 when he says, so I'll just read it again here, because this is the important points of the riddle. What power was it that freed Prometheus from his vultures and transformed the myth into a vehicle of Dionysian wisdom? It is the Heracleian power of music. Having reached its highest manifestation in tragedy, it can invest myths with a new and most profound significance. So the Heracleian power of music resurrects dying myths and gives them a profound metaphysical significance. And then in section 19, to have the Dionysian spirit reborn in our modern world, our godless modern world, then Heracles must cease languishing in ample bondage to Omphale. So back to this letter from 1872. So I'm going to say here, I suggest that when Nietzsche accuses his colleagues, this is page 39, of being castrati suited for sitting at the philological loom, he is saying symbolically that they are like the emasculated Heracles languishing in ample bondage to Omphale, while he, Nietzsche, is like the masculine Aryan god Prometheus after being unbound by Heracles. And then I put section 10. Whom Megasthenes equated with Krishna, the ultimate Aryan god, a philological fact which Nietzsche learned from Lassen, and which I argue is the key to the riddle masking Krishna behind Heracles in The Birth of Tragedy. If my theory is correct, then the 27-year-old Nietzsche, writing in the summer of 1872, believed that his colleagues should have detected as many unannounced literary allusions in The Birth of Tragedy, although the older Nietzsche, who wrote Attempt at a Self-Criticism in 1886, admits twice that it is an impossible book in section 1 and 2 of Attempt at a Self-Criticism about a still unknown God in section 3. So we went over Attempt at a Self-Criticism, the preface Nietzsche added to The Birth of Tragedy in 1886. All right, so continuing here, I'm saying in section 18 of The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche contrasts Indian Brahmanic culture and the Alexandrian culture of curators and librarians who, rather than create their own spiritually satisfying culture, collect around themselves a scientific study of the history of all of the great cultures of the past. And now here's a quote from Nietzsche. so that he might, like Adam with the animals, give them a name. He still remains eternally hungry, the weak and joyless critic, the Alexandrian man, who is basically a wretched librarian and proofreader blinded by book dust and printer's errors, unquote, section 18. All right, so in section 18, Nietzsche says there's three levels of illusion that the underlying will uses to draw the more noble natures who suffer from existence most deeply, luring them back into living, away from suicide. There's three levels of illusion. One is the scientific illusion that we can use reason and science to cure the wound in the heart of nature that causes everyone to suffer. The other one is the illusion of artistic beauty. Just create something beautiful, and that'll serve as a veil to cover up the darkness of the pain and suffering that's really at the heart of nature. And then finally, there's the metaphysical comfort of tragic culture. And then Nietzsche says, if I may give you some historical exemplifications, the Socratic scientific culture is the Alexandrian culture. The artistic culture is a Hellenic culture, which is referring to Greece. And then the tragic culture is Indian Brahmanic culture, which is a very strange thing. Why provide a historical exemplification of tragic culture as Indian Brahmanic culture? Why not just point to the tragic culture of Greece itself? I'm saying because his discussion of tragic culture is just a mask. He's really talking about Indian Brahmanic culture. And therefore the Greek gods are masks for the Indian Brahmanic gods, the three most famous of whom are Krishna, Shiva, and the goddess Shakti or Maya or Durga, and she has many names. And those correlate to Heracles, Dionysus, and Shiva. Dionysus and Apollo represent Shiva and Maya, the demigod goddess pair who preside over Krishna's dream here in the material world. Heracles represents Krishna, the supreme omnipotent. In the Christian Trinity, Krishna would correlate to God the Father. And I'm saying that's what Nietzsche had in mind. As a Christian, he believed by worshiping Krishna, he was being a true Christian. So back to this analysis of the Alexandrian culture with their, blinded by book dust and printer's errors. Then he called the philologists who didn't understand his book. He said they were sitting at the, they're like castrati, better suited for sitting at the loom of textual reconstruction. So he's clearly equating them with the Alexandrian man. But his whole point is that tragic culture, just like the Alexandrians conquered parts of India for a while, in section 20, he says that we need to follow the Dionysian pageant from India to Greece. A revival of this tragic culture is the same as a revival of Indian Brahmanic culture, which is, instead of saying that we can cure the wound of nature with science, it says the wound of nature is eternal, but underlying the world of illusory temporary forms is the absolute eternal will of the universe. And that gave metaphysical comfort in a realization of the eternal joy underlying the pain and suffering. And I'm saying that Nietzsche is prescribing for Europe an embrace, that we embrace, and when he says Europe, he means Western civilization, should embrace the original religion of Christ, which is the Krishna religion, specifically by dancing and chanting the names of Krishna in the streets ecstatically. And I argue this did occur 100 years after Nietzsche wrote the book in Europe, beginning in America, when His Divine Grace A.C. Bhakti Vedanta Swami Prabhupada brought the Hare Krishna movement from India to America and from America around the world. So the bald-headed robe-wearing Hare Krishnas roaring up and down the streets, beating on drums and cymbals, chanting Hare Krishna, the Hare Krishna mantra, that is what Nietzsche had in mind in The Birth of Tragedy. So that, why should I take time to read this book, which Nietzsche himself admits later in life it was an impossible book? Then he also criticizes the style as kind of overly, over the top with its poetic imagery and other things. I think it's a great book. But so at any rate, we're going to continue here. When he calls these people who these philologists, castrati sitting at the loom, he's reminding us of section 19 of the Birth of Tragedy. So then I'm going to go on to say that by comparing the Alexandrian-era philologists to Adam, Nietzsche recalls us to section 9, where, contrasting the creation myth of Prometheus to the creation myth of Adam and Eve, Nietzsche says this myth has the same characteristic significance for the Aryan character, which the myth of the fall has for the Semitic character, and that these two myths are related to each other like brother and sister. So Prometheus is the active masculine Aryan god who created humans and then gave them the fire that he stole from the Olympian gods defiantly. Then here's a quote from Nietzsche, which, by the dignity it confers on sacrilege, contrasts strangely with the Semitic myth of the fall, in which a series of preeminently feminine affects was considered the origin of evil. Okay, so the Aryan creation myth, Prometheus defied Zeus, he defied the gods, he stole fire from them and gave it to the humans that he created. That's the creation myth. In Adam and Eve, God created Adam and Eve, and he says, here you are in the Garden of Eden, it's paradise, it's wonderful, just don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and you're going to be just fine. And the devil, in the form of the snake, tempted Eve to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge and good and evil, which has historically been symbolized as an apple. And then Adam says, oh, why did you do that? And she says, oh, it's okay, we will not die the death. Here, why don't you have a bite? So she seduces Adam into also eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil. And then, so Nietzsche's saying that's preeminently feminine affects. It wasn't an active desire to defy the gods. It was, in this sense, Eve was the motivating actor, and Adam just succumbed to her seduction, is how Nietzsche's presenting this. And I'm saying that Adam, in that instance, so that was what Nietzsche said in section 9, that the myth of Prometheus is Aryan. So that's important. Aryan means Indian for the most part for Nietzsche, Indian Brahmanic in particular. So the myth of Prometheus, and it makes sense to say he was thinking Indian Brahmanic when he goes on to equate tragic culture with Indian Brahmanic culture. So Prometheus is this emblematic myth of the entire Aryan culture, Nietzsche would say. He does say. And I'm saying he's pointing towards the Indian Brahmanic culture. But let me read what I wrote here. This is page 40. So sitting at the loom of textual reconstruction is the emasculating task of the Alexandrian man, whom Nietzsche compares to the weak-willed Adam in section 18, who was coerced seductively by Eve to join her in eating the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, so that Adam is in that respect like Heracles when he was forced to sit at Omphale's loom dressed in women's clothes. All right, so then I say it is no wonder that the professional philologists resented Nietzsche's book, which is a barely veiled attack on academic philology. All right, so that's section 5 of my paper. Now moving on to section 6, Goethe's Prometheus and Krishna's Bhagavad-gita. So this, in section 9, Nietzsche quotes from the poet Goethe his poem Prometheus. The final concluding section of that poem that he quotes, Arthur Schopenhauer also quotes in volume 1 of The World as Will and Representation, which he quotes several pages from that book in The Birth of Tragedy. So he knew that Schopenhauer had used that same exact fragment of Goethe's poem entitled Prometheus. What he doesn't mention is that Schopenhauer introduces that fragment of a poem by comparing it to Krishna and his lesson to his cousin Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, as presented in the Bhagavad-gita, which is one chapter of the great epic, the Mahabharata. So, when Nietzsche calls Prometheus an Aryan myth, and then he quotes from that poem that Schopenhauer compares, or not even compares, he says it's the same, they're teaching the same lesson. So he equates the wisdom of Prometheus with the wisdom of Krishna. Nietzsche must have been aware of that, specifically because, as Thomas Brobjer points out in his copy of The World as Will and Representation, he put marginal marks right next to that part of the book where Schopenhauer talks about Krishna and the Bhagavad-gita. So that's a big clue. He wants us to think of Schopenhauer's book. He quotes from it repeatedly and extensively. So if you've read that book, you're like, oh, Schopenhauer, he used that same exact quote. Oh, wait a minute. He equates it with Krishna's Bhagavad-gita. Oh, wait a minute. Nietzsche says Prometheus is the ultimate Aryan god. And that it was the Heracleian power of music that enabled the myth of Prometheus to become a vehicle for the Dionysian wisdom. So then it all starts to click. When he equates tragic culture with Indian Brahmanic culture, he's thinking of the way that Megasthenes and the other Greeks in India after Alexander the Great equated Heracles with Krishna and Dionysus with Shiva. So that's the riddle. So let me just read here, starting at the bottom of page 40. Further evidence for my theory that Nietzsche identifies himself with Prometheus Unbound, whom he links to Krishna via Heracles in the Birth of Tragedy, comes from Thomas H. Brobjer, who points out that Nietzsche marked certain parts of his copy of Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation that mention Hindu philosophy. So here's a quote from Brobjer. In the first volume of, now he says the title in German, so let me try to mangle this, Die Welt als Will und Vorstellung. There are annotations, that's the World as Will and Representation. There are annotations on pages 324, 326, and 333 near discussions of Shiva, Vishnu, and Veda. And on page 335, Nietzsche made a marginal line by a reference to Bhagavad-gita and an account of Krishna and Arjuna. So that's what Brobjer says. So the book that he put the marginal lines in, his original copy of The World as Will and Representation was missing. This was another set of that two-volume work that Nietzsche bought in 1875. So it was sometime in 1875 or after that Nietzsche put those marks there. But still, I'm saying he put those marks there because he remembered, I'm saying, this is my theory, that in The Birth of Tragedy, he used the same Goethe poem that Schopenhauer quotes and equates with Krishna's Bhagavad-gita. So let me read now from The World as Will and Representation. So here's what Schopenhauer says. He talks about Krishna, and then he quotes the poem from Goethe. So the present is the only real form of the phenomenon of the will. So space, time, and causality, that is representation, or the veil of Maya. The will is the underlying Brahman. The world of phenomena, says Kant, is the world of space, time, and causality, these temporary forms. Noumena is the underlying, empirically unobservable ground of being. So since the world of the will is free from the veil of Maya, it's not subject to the vicissitudes of the passage of time. That's what he means when he says, and now I'll just read the rest of this quote, the present is the only real form of the phenomenon of the will. Therefore, no endless past or future in which he will not exist can frighten him, for he regards these as an empty mirage in the web of Maya. This is people who understand this Vedic philosophy. Thus, he would no more have to fear death than the sun would the night. In the Bhagavad-gita, Krishna puts his young pupil Arjuna in this position when, seized with grief at the sight of the armies ready for battle, somewhat after the manner of Xerxes, Arjuna loses heart and wishes to give up the fight to avert the destruction of so many thousands. Krishna brings him to this point of view, and the death of those thousands can no longer hold him back. He gives the sign for battle. This point of view is also expressed by Goethe's Prometheus, especially when he says, quote, here sit I, form men in my own image, a race that is like me, to suffer, to weep, to enjoy and to rejoice, and to heed you not as I. So he's speaking to the Olympian gods. I create the race of men to heed you not, just like me. I defy you, and so will they, says Prometheus about his creation, the human species, as he's, I don't know if he's at this point chained to a rock for his sacrilege or not. But you see here that first Schopenhauer talks about Krishna in the Bhagavad-gita And then he says, this point of view is also expressed by Goethe's Prometheus, especially when he says, and then there was the poem. All right, so let me continue here. This is my paper, page 41. Brobjer explains that Nietzsche's original copy, all right, I already explained that. So this is his 1875 copy that he bought in 1875. So when Nietzsche made that mark, sometime in 1875 or after, next to Krishna in the Bhagavad-gita, he must have recalled that he quoted exactly the same concluding verses of Goethe's poem Prometheus, to which Schopenhauer compares Krishna's Bhagavad-gita in section 9 of The Birth of Tragedy, prefacing it by describing what, here's Nietzsche's quote in section 9 of The Birth of Tragedy. The youthful Goethe was able to reveal to us in the audacious words of his Prometheus. And then he quoted that same exact fragment of that poem. So I say that Nietzsche was thinking of Schopenhauer's comparison of Krishna and Prometheus when he quoted the same fragment of Goethe's poem in section 9 is indicated further by his claim that, quote from Nietzsche, section 9, the Prometheus story is an original possession of the entire Aryan community of peoples and evidences their gift for the profoundly tragic, unquote. So Nietzsche's writing to fellow Schopenhauer enthusiasts like Richard Wagner. Anyone who has read The World as Will and Representation as avidly as Nietzsche had would immediately notice, oh, that's the same fragment of Goethe's poem that Schopenhauer used. Oh yeah, and Schopenhauer equates that with Krishna's wisdom in the Bhagavad-gita. Nietzsche says that this Prometheus myth is the original possession of the entire Aryan communities of people. That points to India. And he furthermore, in section 18, equates tragic culture with Indian Brahmanic culture. In section 20, he says, we'll follow the Dionysian pageant from India to Greece. So it is very likely that Nietzsche was thinking of the equation of Krishna's wisdom and the wisdom of Prometheus when he used that same fragment of the poem Prometheus by Goethe. So then I explain a little bit. So Heracles freed Prometheus from his vultures. Similarly, Krishna convinces Arjuna to commit what he perceived initially as the greatest sacrilege of all, killing his own kinsmen and practically the entire warrior caste on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, which he predicted would lead to the eventual collapse of Vedic civilization and the beginning of the age of sin, Kali Yuga. So Arjuna was overwhelmed with guilt. He didn't want to kill his kinsmen on both sides. He didn't want to end the Vedic civilization and the Brahminical caste system. He said, all these things will collapse if we fight this battle because we'll be taking out an entire caste, the warrior caste. And without them, the whole thing falls apart. He was riddled with guilt. Krishna relieved him of that guilt, just like Heracles relieved Prometheus of the vultures incessantly eating his liver. Krishna told Arjuna that souls are eternal, nobody's going to die. Furthermore, you're a kshatriya, you're a warrior, that's your duty to fight a good fight, regardless of the consequences, which is a lot like Immanuel Kant, who says you should act only out of respect for the idea of a universal law and not be concerned at all with the consequences of your actions. This is anti-utilitarian, anti-John Stuart Mill. And then finally, Krishna tells Arjuna, I am the supreme God, and you and everyone else are just parts and parcels of my supreme soul. So all you should think about is serving me with love. If you do that, you will be fine. Don't worry about the consequences. That's not your concern. So then Arjuna was freed from his guilt and he engaged in the battle. So I am saying, let me just read a little bit here. This is the bottom of page 43. To review this important piece of evidence, Nietzsche's primary target audience in The Birth of Tragedy is fellow Schopenhauer enthusiasts like Wagner. So it makes sense that he would have expected at least some of his readers to recognize the correlation Schopenhauer made between Krishna's Bhagavad-gita and Goethe's Prometheus when he quoted the same fragment of that poem in section 9 of The Birth of Tragedy. And then here I'll end this video with a quote from Robert Bruce Cohen, who says that to understand The Birth of Tragedy, we need to understand the world as will and representation. Well, to understand that, we need to understand Vedic thought. So this is a quote from Robert Bruce Cohen. And then he quotes from another Nietzsche scholar. So Martha C. Nussbaum warns that the reader of Die Geburt der Tragedy, so the birth of tragedy, must have already read Schopenhauer to understand his dichotomy of Apollinian and Dionysian. Yet Schopenhauer warns the reader of his masterwork, The World as Will and Representation, I'm not going to read it in German again, must have already read the Upanishads to understand his work. Thus, one might argue that an acquaintance with Vedic thought is crucial to an understanding of the birth of tragedy. So, in a brief review, he wrote a letter in the summer of 1872 calling the philologists who did not understand his book. He says, the book is masculine by nature. These castrati are better suited for sitting at the loom of textual reconstruction. That, I'm saying, calling the book masculine recalls us to section 9 of The Birth of Tragedy, where Nietzsche says that the myth of Prometheus is the property of the entire Aryan people who had this wonderful gift for a tragic wisdom. And then when he talks about castrati sitting at the loom of textual reconstruction, that's an allusion to section 19 of The Birth of Tragedy, where Nietzsche says that for the Dionysian wisdom to wake up in modern Europe, Heracles must cease languishing in ample bondage to Omphale. Heracles killed an innocent man. The oracle at Delphi said, you need to be sold into slavery for a year to purge you of your sin. The widowed queen of Lydia, Omphale, bought Heracles, made him wear women's clothes while she wore his clothes and carried his club, and made him, in women's clothes, sit at the loom and weave cloth like a woman. So Nietzsche was giving a hint. You didn't understand what I was trying to do in The Birth of Tragedy, but I'm not in the least inclined to sympathize with you for your lack of understanding, because this book is masculine. It's Aryan. So section 9 and section 18 enlighten us about the letter that he wrote in 1872, castigating the philologists who castigated his book. And then in section 9 also, after saying, the Aryan myth of Prometheus, the creation myth, shows this active masculine will to defy the gods, while the feminine myth of Adam and Eve shows how they didn't actively defy God, they were kind of seduced into it, and through their weakness they defied the gods. So the Aryan Prometheus, through his strength, said, I renounce you and I defy you openly. I'm not going to apologize for it. Whereas Adam and Eve were kind of tricked by the devil, and then Adam was kind of tricked by Eve, and they were both kind of like, oh, we didn't mean to do it. But so Nietzsche's saying that contrast. But the point is, when he calls his book masculine, he's saying it's Aryan, and that's an allusion to the Indian Brahmanic culture. And then in section 9, where he also talks about the Aryans and the Semitic, like brother and sister, male and female, he quotes that segment of Goethe's poem Prometheus that Schopenhauer also quoted in The World as Will and Representation, which Nietzsche quotes repeatedly in The Birth of Tragedy, and Schopenhauer equates that with Krishna's wisdom and his lesson to Arjuna in the Bhagavad-gita, which is the ultimate Indian Brahmanic philosophical book. So that's more evidence that the riddle in The Birth of Tragedy is that Nietzsche, imitating Megasthenes and the Alexandria-era Greeks, equates Heracles with Krishna and Dionysus with Shiva. And in the next video, which will be the last one covering The Birth of Tragedy, I'm going to discuss how tragic culture, Nietzsche presents it as an antidote to what this is a quote, a Buddhistic negation of the will. And then I'll explain how Christian Lassen, his theory was, and Eugene Burnouf, he got it from Eugene Burnouf, who was another famous European, in this case French, Sanskrit philologist. Their theory was that the Brahmins of the 5th century B.C.E. amplified the older myth of Krishna into the supreme form of Vishnu, specifically to counteract Buddhism. And that's what Nietzsche's trying to do. He advocates a rebirth of tragedy, but he equates tragic culture with Indian Brahmanic culture, and he specifically says that the Greeks in the 5th century were saved from the danger of falling into a Buddhistic negation of the will by tragic culture. So that'll be the next video, and that is it for this one.